Okay, so I will now open the meeting. So welcome everyone and thank you very much for joining us. And so Ninamani, which means hello, how are you, from Ghana country. So I'm calling in from the lands of the Ghana people of the Adelaide Plains in South Australia. And I wish to pay respects on behalf of all of us to the Indigenous peoples or traditional owners or custodians from across the lands that we're all calling in from, and acknowledge their ongoing custodianship of the land, the sea, the waters and the sky of the areas that we all live and work on. And, you know, pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that, you know, sovereignty has not been ceded by, you know, these peoples. Okay, so we've got a fantastic webinar set up for you. So I just wanted to just let you know, so we've got a coordinating committee for the network here in Australia, Aotearoa. And so we've got, so Frank, we've got Natalie, Hao Jin and Leah Feuerhart are co-coordinators with myself. And I think Claire Doherty is also on the line as well. I don't think we've got anyone else from the committee here, but I also want to do a shout out to Lavanita, who is coordinator for the CCNet Southeast Asia. So, and I know that she's also been encouraging others, as has Hao Jin, been encouraging people to join from Aotearoa as well. So we've got this fantastic webinar, Development by Design, which is around kind of linking, you know, development planning in areas with kind of conservation standards or healthy country plans, and how do you make use of those so they're not, you know, any development plans that happen are not going off on a different tangent and not actually following the wishes of the communities. So I will hand over to Frank, I think, to lead and introduce all the speakers. It's Frank.
All right, thank you so much, Sarah, and welcome everyone. I shall share my screen. So, first of all, thank you for joining. And as Sarah was saying, this webinar is kind of exploring the development by design approach and how the Nature Conservancy applied development by design with Indigenous communities in Australia, and looking at an innovative way of linking conservation planning and development decision making. Aside from being on the CCNet Australia, I'm convening as well with Sam Bailey, who is on this call, the Community of Practice Conservation Standards Projects on Indigenous Land and Waters. So we are a thematic CCNet franchise that trying to assist Indigenous people and local communities around the world in accessing relevant adaptations of the conservation standards. And today I'm joined by a fantastic team that I really enjoyed working with over those past, I think, 5 years by now. And I probably would say each of you guys quickly introduce yourselves. We got David Hinchley here on the call, the North Australia Program Director from TNC.
Good day. Yeah, you can see the brief description. I look after the North Australian Outback program for TNC, which work with communities across northern and arid lands, I guess. My background's in community-based conservation in various countries, as well as Australia. Frank?
And then, thank you, David. And then we have Mike Heiner, who wants to be an Australian, but who is calling in from the US.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, sadly, it's been a few years. My name is Mike Heiner. I've spent conservation planner with TNC's Global Protect Science team, a big part of that work is development by design, which is a strategy for bringing development and conservation planning into one process. And the focus in Australia is particularly around supporting free, prior, and informed consent. And as we'll hear about shortly.
Terrific. And then last but not least, hailing in from the Kimberley, we have Damien Perryman, who changed roles since this project started. But I'll let Damien introduce himself.
Thanks, Frank. Yes, so my name is Damien Perryman, and yeah, was involved in the initial pilot development by design project here in the Kimberleys as the CEO of Wallaloo Aboriginal Corporation. Now the CEO of Credit Enterprises, who provide a range of services to native title groups across the Kimberleys and Australia, and looking to broaden the I guess rollout of development by design across our networks. Terrific. And with that introduction, I reckon let's dive into this webinar. So as we said, it's about development by design and looking at the example of what happened in Australia, how we can link conservation planning with development decision making. And with that, I'll hand over to David to give us a little bit of a rundown why there is actually a need for development by design.
Okay, thanks, Frank. I'm going to keep it fairly high level. There's other people on this call that know much more about individual aspects of this. Like Mike's obviously got a lot of experience in development by design, how it's been applied globally in various countries. Michael Looker has also been involved in this in his role with TNC. Damien obviously knows much more about native title and development approval processes. So I'll try to touch on things, but maybe we can dig into any of the issues a bit more in the discussion. So I'll just sort of flag the key things that were behind our thinking of doing this approach in Australia. So the first slide is really about why is it important. Globally, obviously, a lot of land is managed and looked after by Indigenous peoples and local communities. A lot of those areas are highly threatened by various things. There's all sorts of barriers, laws and policies. There's lots of government processes, all sorts of things that people have to navigate to look after those lands. That's some mapping that the global team has done, and Mike can talk more about that if it's needed later. On to the next slide. And those issues are equally relevant across Northern Australia. There's all sorts of development pressures and opportunities. There's a lot of land under native title of various forms and other types of Aboriginal Indigenous people ownership. There's globally significant biodiversity, huge areas of land that are managed by Indigenous peoples. There's development pressures, threats. There's lots of things people are trying to navigate in looking after their lands, their communities, trying to build a future for their communities. So thinking about how do you combine development decisions with conservation programs, with people's futures is really important. And we've tried to adapt the development by design process to help with some of those processes. So if you jump to the next slide, Frank.
And maybe for those calling in from Southeast Asia, when we speak about native title, we mean land rights in Australia. That is just the federal law that grants rights to Indigenous people in Australia. But yeah, land rights is kind of a term that probably resonates more with people from different backgrounds.
Yeah, thanks, Frank. So next slide. So development by design is a TNC term, but it really means about how do you think about development and conservation together. And Mike could probably talk more about this, but it's been used at various scales. It's been used to look across large landscapes about siting different types of development and minimising conflicts with conservation work. It's been used at national scale in some countries. And here we have tried to think about how it works at community level. How can we get tools and information in the hands of people who own and are responsible for managing those lands, and help them have good discussions internally, make good decisions, but also engage in development approval processes through understanding impacts, and not just on conservation values or development opportunities, but also on other aspects of things that are important to that community. And that's where the link back to the Healthy Country Plan comes in, because that's where the values and threats and opportunities are often initially identified. So it's anyway, we'll go into the detail of the tool later. So yeah, move on, that's good. Yeah, so some of the thinking about that is, getting information and tools available to people to have that information available, link back to the values and the things people care about, and helps inform decision making. There's a couple other dot points there, I think. So part of it's understanding the impacts on those values that people care about. So it's conservation, cultural, other values people want to look after, and they should be able to have a say in what happens on their lands and determine what goes on their lands. So that's a complicated question, but we've tried to use this development by design process to assist communities have that say. Next one, please. So the context is that there's, from that earlier map, you saw there's a lot of traditional rights and interests across Northern Australia, across all lands in Australia. Native title, which is the land rights opportunity Frank was talking about, recognises some of those and articulates those. Maybe click down the others. And there is structure set up for some of those interests to be represented in decision making and what goes on lands. And the registered native title body corporate is a thing set up to represent the native title interest for a native title area that's declared. And Damien can explain all this much better later if need be. Okay, and next up, please. And yeah, they are the RNTBC or some sort of Indigenous organisation often manages the implementation of a healthy country plan through ranges. So linking the decision making with what's going on the ground is also an important part of thinking how to manage all this. Sorry. And
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I just got a thing flashed up on my screen and blocked it. I was just trying to get rid of it. And so the registered native title body corporate also represents those interests in any development approval processes for development proposals that might impact on those values. So they're an important key part of the process, and that's partly why we focused the initial pilot on that level. So on a community level, decision making and participation and influence on the process of decision making. So I guess it's a particular application of the DVD approach at community level that we've been trying to use. DVD can potentially be applied at different scales, and we're also, in future directions, we might talk a bit about how do you actually start looking at the links between community level and more regional scale planning and national level approval processes. Okay, so next one.
All right. And so one of the issues around environmental impact assessments that we face here in Australia is that they recognize they recognize certain species, certain places, let's say threatened and endangered plant species, threatened and endangered or IUCN red listed animal species in Australia through different acts, legal acts that are on a state level. they recognize cultural and heritage sites. What are definitely very important values to recognize. But when you work with a community, there is often more, and that more is falling between the cracks in the common environmental impact assessments as they've been undertaken for a long time. And those are, for example, for a community, specific animal species that may not be threatened, but that may constitute an important part of their diet, like let's say in Australia, kangaroos, emus, bush turkey, things like that. That would kind of, not be considered by a generic impact assessment. Those lighter blue boxes that we see here, those are the examples from the Walalaku Healthy Country Plan that was developed with the Nginamangala traditional owner community. And so they, being in the arid land of the Kimberley region, freshwater is a really important value, but none of the freshwater places are Ramsar listed or else, so they would, again, not necessarily be considered. And that's, I guess, based on this background, that's when the team kind of jumped in and the Nature Conservancy started engaging with Walalaku to see how can we bridge this gap. And we just want to very briefly talk about this case study, and Damien, please chime in at any given point in time. So Damien was the CEO of Walalaku Aboriginal Corporation. When you look at this map that depicts the northwest of Australia, the bold black line is the area of the Nginamangala native title determination, and the slightly bigger area is the catchment of the Fitzroy River and some of its tributaries. They are kind of Nginamangala being Nginamangala traditional owner being located at the mouth of the river. They clearly have a lot of flow-on effects from whatever is happening upstream. I'm not sure if there is anything that you would like to add there, Damien.
I don't think so, not at this point.
Cool. And so the reason why the Nginamangala people engaged in a healthy country planning project, they wanted to achieve their vision, and that is to maintain and protect their cultural values like language, customs, passing on of traditional knowledge. Being in the Fitzroy Valley in an arid part of Australia, the Fitzroy River, or Madawara, as it is called in local language, is an incredibly important value with a lot of cultural stories linked to, and it's been kind of the life artery through the last 60,000 years of people living in the area. A lot of that has happened around the river, and having had a ranger team for many years, they were really concerned about a lot of the environmental values, and they want to make sure that no further plants or animal species on their country are lost, that the local biodiversity is improved. When we did the healthy country planning with them, one of the really important things that they pointed out in their vision is as well that the decisions of traditional owners, of native title holders, First Nation peoples, are respected, and that they are in the driver's seat and in control to avoid any further damage to country and culture. What is a huge responsibility, and what requires often innovative ways of implementing that, because sadly enough, the law is not always in place to make it very easy for Indigenous people in Australia. As David was saying earlier, north of Australia has been the focus of over the decades of many different development programs. Unlocking the north of Australia is a catchphrase in Canberra often. So at the time when this plan was developed, damming and water infrastructure was a key thing that was high on the cards. It was all this water that gets wasted because it only gets in the ocean and it's not used for some irrigated agriculture. There's always in the north the threat of mining, water extraction for fodder, and with a lot of the past development that happened since the 1960s, a lot of invasive plants and animals have been introduced to that country, and any prospective mines upstream would cause a lot of problems for Nginamangala traditional owners downstream from pollution, contamination, and tailing. And then North Australia being cattle country, so grazing and unsustainable herd management has as well a huge impact on their land. So yeah, that was kind of that is a little bit the context. So very high conservation values, very high threats, and that's when the Nature Conservancy came in with the development by design process to try out how can we find a way out of this predicament. And with that, I would like to hand over to Mike to talk us a little bit about the technicalities, since he's been the mastermind behind all this.
Not exactly true, but thanks, Frank. I'll talk more specifically about the information system that we built to support the Walluwaluku Aboriginal Corporation in assessing and negotiating development proposals based on the Healthy Country Plan. So the Healthy Country Plan defines a set of values or targets, those broad categories of those targets are shown here. And our task was then to develop data to map those values that can be mapped. And those are shown in bold here, cultural heritage sites and other features. Freshwater places, which have, of course, important, great natural values, biodiversity values, but also extremely important cultural values, is particularly in this arid monsoonal landscape, as Frank mentioned before. Other categories include native animals and native food and medicinal plants. Next slide, thanks, Frank. So cultural heritage sites include a variety of features, as probably you all know better than me. Rock art, ceremonial sites, sacred historical sites. The sources for those locations are archaeological surveys. The cultural features we mapped also included song lines, digitized at a participatory mapping workshop. The freshwater places include rivers, wetlands, and water bodies that we mapped with a biophysical habitat classification that you see on the screen here. This is a spatial model that we built, drawn from existing data sets such as the National Vegetation Information System, surface hydrology. Yeah.
Can I just interrupt? Sorry, there's something I forgot to say up front, which I think is important. Is prior to doing any of this, we developed a data management and protection agreement with agreed protocols about who owned the data and who could look at it and how we would protect it and make sure other people didn't see it inappropriately. So that was right up front. I meant to mention that at the start. Sorry.
Thanks, David. No, that's a really important point. And one challenge, I can't say we found a solution to it, is how to make that sensitive private data available for decision making while keeping it private so that it was not public. And that might be something to talk about at the end. So back to the to continue talking about spatial data. So the freshwater places included rivers, wetlands, and water bodies mapped with a spatial model of biophysical habitat, which you see on the right, from a variety of sources. And this was a really important data set for representing freshwater places, but also for representing plants and animals, which I'll talk about in a minute, and also as sort of providing the template for understanding habitat and ecosystem service provision. So next slide, please. So native animals and native plants include both common species that we assume will be well represented by these major habitat types in this map, this habitat classification. The assumption is that the distribution of those common species follows habitat broadly. The other type of species we want to consider here are rare and threatened, are protected species, which include rare, threatened, range limited species that are not well represented by a generic habitat map. So for these, we developed habitat models These are really simple sort of envelope models. We didn't have a lot of data. We went through a really important expert review process to get these right. I should mention at this point now, the NESP has developed species models for over 1,000 native species across Northern Australia, really across all of Australia. And that's a tremendous resource for future iterations of this type of work. And I would also back up a little bit and say that we developed a biophysical habitat map specifically for this part of the Kimberley and Nikinamungla country. This type of information is really interchangeable with existing land use, land cover maps or vegetation maps. Next slide, please.
And to quickly explain an abbreviation Mike used, NESP is the Environmental Science Program, and that the federal government has been rolling out for many years, that has developed quite a lot of research outcomes.
Thanks, Frank. Next slide, please. So, thinking about ecosystem service provision of these ecosystem types, that ecosystem service provision depends largely on access to those areas. So to represent that element of ecosystem service provision, we developed this simple spatial model of access, of accessibility based on distance from population centers and roads, weighted by the population size and road type. And this is just a picture then meant to be a picture of accessibility across the landscape. Next slide, please. Next slide, please, Frank. Next slide, please. There you go. So along those lines, ecosystem service provision also depends on the condition or ecological integrity and habitat quality of major habitat types. So to represent that, we did two things. First, we developed this map, which is a spatial index of cumulative impacts from land use infrastructure, which is meant to represent the sort of function as a coarse generalized measure of habitat quality and ecological condition to represent the number of native and the number and health of native plant and animal species in those areas. Next slide. We also pulled down data provided by the NAFI, the Northern Australia Fire Information Center. Please correct me if I got that wrong. That provides this really valuable data that can be used to represent the frequency of destructive late dry season fires, which are also an indicator of how healthy the land is in any given part of the native title determination. So these metrics of access and disturbance are meant to represent ecological condition and ecosystem service provision. Next slide, please. So to make this information accessible for analysis and impact assessment, we build a customized GIS tool that, given a user-defined impact area or polygon, such as a proposed mining lease, will generate a report listing the natural and cultural values that occur in that footprint. And this now, we have a Esri version and an open source QGIS version that we have replicated in a few other parts of the Kimberley and Cape York. Next slide. So backing up, the purpose of all of this, as I mentioned before, is one, to provide evidence for Aboriginal corporations to review and negotiate development proposals. Two, to support free, prior, and informed consent, which is part of good mitigation. So then three, to provide information to guide the mitigation hierarchy, particularly decisions around avoiding impacts. And I think this is the point where I hand it over to David and Damien.
Okay, so Damien, do you want me to run through these, or do you want to dive straight in? I can do an overview if you want to, or you can.
Yeah, I thought you were going to do these ones.
Yeah, will do.
Yep.
Okay, so some of the things that came out of the experience of doing it here was the benefits that we've seen from feedback from the corporation was it has given them some more capacity to engage in the decision-making processes. And part of that, I think, was just pulling all that information together into a place. There's a lot of work to source information from all sorts of places and then add all the different layers that related back to the values in the Healthy Country Plan. And then just be able to see that on maps, visualize it, maybe just do all the dot points out, Frank, I'll just talk generally. Visualize the values, where they are, where the impacts are likely to occur with the outputs from running the tool, putting in various development footprints and seeing the impacts of them, and then be able to discuss that internally and then be ready for the discussions with developers or with the government approval processes, I think was where the value came from. So I think there's internal decision making. It's facilitated by having this information at hand and being able to be updated, being able to look at different footprints of development impacts with different buffer zones that they can define when they do the run the process, and then evidence that they can feed into things like expedited procedure process, which is one of the processes that they might go through for when there's a development they want to. Is that contest? Is that the right word, Damien? Or to negotiate? And then it also allows people to be on the front foot for discussions. I think they're the key things that have come out of the experience there. Did I miss anything, Damien? Do you want to add anything?
No, I'll just add the expedited procedure process in Western Australia is something that the WA government has introduced, which basically says we will approve a project on your country because we don't believe it impacts on your native title rights and interests. So this is a way of demonstrating quickly how a project can impact on native title rights and interests.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so next one. So we've continued to work on this, and this is a map of Cape York. Those two black areas are where we're trying to do some similar work. The pink areas are mines and mining. The pink boundaries are mining approval, exploration licenses. So there's a range of, again, there's a range of threats and opportunities coming. And we're also looking at, because there's multiple groups in those bigger areas, how do we look at regional databases? Because some of the base layers can be done much more efficiently by looking at the whole region. And then how do we split that up for each group to have their own information, which they can look after themselves and make their own decisions and discussions. And then ultimately, there may be a way of even looking at how do you aggregate some of that back up if you're involved in a regional planning process or something you need to work on together. So that's sort of where we want to head with by looking at it at a regional scale. And there's obviously opportunities everywhere. The Commonwealth Government's looking at regional planning to expedite development. They're talking about reducing barriers to development, but also making better regional planning, looking at cumulative impacts. So if we can do this well and have communities being able to represent their own interests, but also talk to neighbours and look at the impacts across territories, it's probably a good thing to work on as well. So the next slide, please. So I think the free, prior and informed consent is a key principle, but I think it's good to try to get beyond free, prior and informed consent, actually be much more proactive. So people are on the front foot and determining what happens on their land. Even before a development application, they've got their ideas in place. They can also look at, and development options they might want to explore themselves. So you can look at the impacts of those versus impacts of development proposals coming in from other proponents, like mining companies or irrigated ag or whatever. But being able to do that gives you some evidence and capacity to exercise your rights and also support those internal processes. Part of the thinking, the second point about capacity, is often native title representative groups are fairly poorly resourced and funded. There's lots of issues coming at them they have to deal with. They haven't got a lot of staff, they've got short timeframes. So having this stuff ready, we think, can help people be more prepared and have better evidence and the tools to present that evidence in a better form. For companies coming in, we think there's also an issue of that whole social license to operate that developers have. And if we could convince developers to actually support this community-based planning process, they could actually demonstrate their social license to operate much more proactively and actually reduce their risk in the long run by accepting that communities have to be in the driving seat about making decisions on their land rather than it being an issue of conflict. That if they can support this type of work up front, that will actually make a more fruitful discussion and build trust and credibility. So I think there's an issue around social license to operate that also relates to this. And the last point there is, obviously, biodiversity and socio-cultural values are closely linked in everything. Separating out conservation separately from how culture's thought about, how community development's thought about, is putting things in silos, and they obviously you need to be thinking about those trade-offs and opportunities together. And so that's another one of the reasons we've tried to bring those things together in this tool, which sort of flows on from what Healthy Country Planning tries to do in some ways as well. So that's some thoughts. Was there another slide, Frank? Was that it?
No, that is the last slide. A lot of this work that Mike and David and Damien spoke about, we've been able to write down in a few resources that I'm just putting in the chat for you guys. May take a second or two until they send through because internet is slow over here. So one is an article that kind of describes specifically the Niganamangala example, moving from reactive to proactive decision making. And another book chapter that just recently came out that looks at how development by design can help Indigenous people be innovative in that land use decision making process. And they should by now have come through to all of you who are interested. Yeah, I'm not sure, Mike, Damien, if there is anything that you would like to add to this, to the conclusion and the outcomes.
Not here. Curious to hear any questions, comments.
Yeah, that's the same with me.
All right, then. Just the very last slide before we're going to stop sharing and we can see all our faces again. If you want to stay in touch about all those things, the community practice is running as well its own listserv through which some of you may have gotten this invite. If you scan the QR code, it should bring you to the CCNet, the broader CCNet homepage, where you can subscribe to the listserv, where a lot of those resources that we've just been talking about are posted as well. So yeah, please feel free. And if you got at any point in time any questions, get in touch with myself or with Sam Bailey, who is on this call as well, I assume. All right, with that, I shall stop sharing and you may want to ask some questions to those wonderful presenters. And I would like to say a big thank you as well to David and Mike, who is working late at night to join this call, and Damien. It's been a really exciting project and I'm really grateful of having been able to work with you guys. And Christina, you raised your hand. The first question goes over to Mexico, of all places.
Hello, thank you, David and Mike and Damien and Frank for putting this together. It's a really great opportunity to learn from your experience. And I was wondering, what is your recommendation, or based on your experience, in regards to the level of detail of the actual development projects? I don't know how it works in Australia, but for example, in Mexico, we are currently struggling with some very significant development projects, and they are quite obscure. They don't really share information. They are not abiding by law, so they have not made their impact statements. And some of them are being done by the army, so it's very difficult to get information. So how have you handled that? And my second question is, in your experience, what's the time frame to put this together if you have access to some solid mapping information that you already have? Can this be done in a fairly quick way if you have access to a GIS expert, or does it have a steep learning curve? Sorry to ask such complicated questions.
No, those are good questions. I'll jump in because I think I'm probably in a position to answer those because I worked on the GIS mechanics. To the first question, it is not a very, it's not necessary to have a very precise map of the footprint. The more precise and more accurate it is, the more detailed it is, the better, because it'll be then better. The impact assessment will be more accurate as a result. But even so, just having a lease block or even a user polygons or footprint digitized roughly an approximation, that will work. The tool will work just fine to give you an idea of impacts. So that's it can really be anything. One thing to keep in mind is that the impacts, of course, even if you did have a detailed map or GIS layer representing the footprint, the impacts would extend quite a large way beyond that immediate footprint. So even if you did have that kind of detailed picture of the footprint, you would probably want to create a buffer or draw a larger impact area to really measure impact. So it's not a limitation, but the better idea you have of what the footprint will be, then the more the better able you will be to do an accurate impact analysis. To the question of replicating the tool, it's a good one. The more data you have in hand to represent values at the beginning, the better. For the first project in Nicanamangala country with Walalaku, I'd say we spend more than half of the time thinking through how the tool would work and what kind of questions it would answer, but also developing data to go into the tool. And I would say for all the replicates of the tool, they've gone a lot faster because we already had in our minds kind of sorted out what kind of data we needed and how to fit it into the tool. And the tool was already built. So this tool I think is highly replicable anywhere on Earth, really. And there, as you can probably see from reading the report, there's a range of values of spatial data sets that it reads to measure impacts, but it doesn't need all of those. In other words, it can work just fine with a subset of information, though of course the more information you have on values and the more detailed that information is, the more detailed the impact analysis will be. But that's not a barrier to run the tool. I have to say, and this is something David and Frank and Damien and I have struggled with a bit, is that there is a bit of work in creating that's really more tedious than anything. It's not rocket science, but there is some work to then recode the tool to read a different data library. And one approach we've taken to make that easier is to start developing data at a regional scale across the Kimberley, for example, across Cape York. So then the source data is available, more readily available for each individual tool replication, for each individual native title determination. And we hope it will also support a regional approach to mitigation and to impact assessment and negotiation, which of course will be good for cultural values and for biodiversity values, because a big challenge of effective conservation is working at the landscape level, and that's really a big challenge for mitigation too. So that regional approaches will be very helpful in that regard. So I guess my point would be to apply this in other places, such as in Mexico. It might be helpful to make this part of a regional planning exercise where a lot of the information may have already been organized and compiled, and then feeding that into the tool will be a relatively smaller task. But I would say probably a few months to generate a replicate if all the spatial data is in order. But if you have projects, I'm really eager to try to test this in other places. So I'd be happy to talk more about that. Sorry, David, Frank, did I miss anything there? You guys have been in the trenches with me trying to figure this out.
Yeah, I think the other thing I'll just add is the technical aspects, but there's also the thinking through who's going to be making the decisions, who are the right people to hold the information, how do you support local decision making, and then if you're going to scale it up to a regional approach, what are the protocols? Well, and then even within one area, when we're doing the work with Nick and the Mangala community, we talked about decision making framework. What were the things they were thinking about when they're making decisions? And that's an internal discussion for the group, but there's a fair bit of thinking around it as well as just the data and how we're going to use data and what are the key things we're going to think about when we're making decisions.
Yeah, and since a lot of the information, some of the information can be very sensitive, I guess the doing and developing, undertaking the conservation standards aspect of it at the right time for the community and having relationships that are built so people trust you is an important thing as well. Like Mike referred beforehand to songline mapping. If you have no pre-existing relationship and no trust between the community and the organization, this can take a lot longer. So you need to kind of calculate in any relationship building aspects.
Absolutely. And I would just say in terms of conservation planning in general, the critical and probably most time consuming or most important and difficult part is a participatory process. So my answer before was speaking strictly to the technical stuff, which is relatively small, but that's only useful if it fits within a larger planning process, of course. I'll also say that a critical first step was having that healthy country plan, which is a participatory process that starts with building trust and then stepping through the whole open standards process. That was essential to do the spatial part because the values were articulated, and then it was a fairly straightforward process then to see what data we had to actually map those values.
Thank you, Mike, and you may regret your offer because I will take you up on it.
Great, look forward to it.
Are there any other questions at the moment? I can see there is.
I've got. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, Michael, you jump.
I was interested to know over what that cumulative impact map that you showed over what kind of time frame that was, and then a further question of that to the group is how is cumulative impact being assessed, if you like, in the kind of approval process after that in terms of the impacts on native title and interests?
try to answer the first question. It was a coarse, generalized measure of impacts across the landscape from different types of anthropogenic land use and infrastructure, mainly transportation infrastructure, population centers. The idea was it was really meant to be a measure of ecological condition, and again, specifically to inform thinking or assessment of ecosystem service provision based on the condition and accessibility of different ecosystem types. Of course, as I from your question, of course, cumulative impacts can mean a lot more potentially, and I think your question was also getting at over what time frame.
Yeah.
And in this case, it was a fairly narrow, fairly simple picture of cumulative impacts.
Right.
Yeah, Michael, I think it's an issue that we still have to work on, because if you have multiple developments happening over time, how do we handle that? With the tool handles that to some extent by sort of you can play with different polygons and look at how they add together.
Yeah.
There's also the bigger regional.
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, I think it's really a powerful process here in terms of that particular issue, and then how those approval processes and so forth are carried out, rather than, you know, those approval processes just being development by development, and then, you know, you lose over time hugely. So how it's factored in, and how that analysis occurs in the decision making and all the rest of it that goes with it, I think is a really critical point.
Yeah, and that's perhaps the fundamental problem that mitigation is supposed to try to solve, but always fails, because EIA and mitigation, they happen project by project, and they very rarely consider things at a regional perspective.
Yeah.
Billy posted in the chat that there is the ESA conference in July in Darwin, where this kind of a talk can fit well into a symposium. David, just something to bear in mind, since you're not too far away from Darwin, well, roughly.
How Jin has her hand up. Got a question?
Thanks. I was just wondering, and this is probably related to Christina's question earlier on, if there's a threshold in terms of when do we call in, make the decision to use development by design. So just kind of going from not all developments are equal in their impacts. Is there a threshold or criteria that people use, or it doesn't distinguish between if it's a small development or a big development? You know, like for example, if it's eco-lodge is being built in the community or near the community versus an oil palm plantation being put in that community.
I think it is probably just kind of a balancing effort and what it requires to develop a development by design tool, and the impact in Australia, and that applies really regionally across all groups. And there is a constant storm of development proposals that Indigenous people have to face. Some are big scale, like a coal mine, some are small scale, like only a telecommunication tower. But just generally, the onslaught of proposals that comes in kind of justifies it. But if you are in a green field where you have nothing on the horizon, there's no development, no major development on the radar, it's probably a bit of effort that you could put somewhere else as well, alternatively.
The tool itself can work for a variety of development footprints. And as David mentioned earlier, it can be used to assess external development proposals or for internal economic development planning. for example, a change in a pastoral lease, or as well as a mine footprint, or really anything in between. There will always have to be some interpretation of what the granular impacts will be beyond that report of systems affected. But I guess the idea is that first report provides important evidence, which Damien referred to earlier, to engage, provide evidence of impacts to then trigger a longer assessment process or negotiation process. But it could serve a variety of purposes. The tool itself could.
All right, thanks.
Sorry, Christina and Sam both got their hand open as well, but I fear that we're probably running maybe out of time. I'm not sure, Sarah, how much.
Yeah, so we are due to close. I think Christina's hand went up first. Is it a very quick one, or yeah?
Maybe it's more food for thought, but I was wondering if, this can be built into the tool. Maybe it is in the tool. That sometimes the development projects make use of the features in, like ecotourism. So, let's build a big hotel here because all the tourists want to go. But then that does ourselves in. So it's, when you think of it from a systemic perspective, the actual development is doing itself in by, doing things in a certain way. So I'm just wondering if, in addition to demonstrating, these are the impacts that you would have, and maybe that is the case of development by design, that we can make that explicit and say, well, if you do it this way, in the end, you will do yourself in, because no one will want to come here because. So is that, you feel that that's already addressed in the way the scenarios are shown, or not necessarily? And I know we only have 1 more minute, so maybe it's more food for thought.
Not necessarily.
Okay. Thanks. Maybe, yes, something to follow up on. Sorry, Mike, did you want to respond to that? Or David?
No, I'm sorry. I said not necessarily. Everyone, please feel free to email Frank questions.
Yeah,
email us questions.
And I wanted to say as well, we're running these webinars for our friends in the Americas and our friends in Africa and Europe next week. So on Monday, I think, because of the time delay, because of the time zones, is the webinar in America. And we have a webinar on lunchtime for Central Africa time zone as well. So please feel free to join in. And maybe, Christina, you can be on another call. And thank you very much all for joining and for the opportunity of presenting. And thanks to my co-presenters.
Yeah, iterate that. Thanks very much to Frank, Damien, David and Mike for doing the presentation, and thanks to all of you for joining us. So the video will go up onto the CCNet Australia Aotearoa website, and we'll have another one in 2 months on the 25th of May, so I encourage you to join for that. Also, if you want to follow us on LinkedIn, I've just put that in the chat. And then you can see anything that we're coming up, and have a good day, everybody. Thanks for joining. Can I just ask committee members to stay on the call? We'll just have a quick meeting. Thanks.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. 8 cái lò.
Just a couple of people still on who maybe are busy doing the stuff. Hi, Billy, Rudy. Billy and Rudy, we are just going into a committee meeting now, so I'm going to put you or take you out of the meeting. Thanks for joining us.
We're still recording too, so let's see.
Oh, thanks. Sure.